Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Sarah Bacon and the room host this afternoon, and I wanted to welcome you all. Thanks to Shire for hosting our lunch. Thanks to Horizon Pharma for hosting this panel on your care and support team. And I'd like to introduce you to our two lovely panelists, Lori Leathers, who is a parent advocate and financial advisor at 1847 Financial, and Eileen Clark, the president for the Association of Child Life Professionals, who will walk us through coping with a long-term hospital stay. I just wanted to remind everyone, we do have the mobile app. If you care to ask questions live, I'll be circulating after the two presentations with a mic, or if you'd rather submit a question, you can do so on the app at the agenda item for this event. So with no further ado, welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for attending our session today. Very happy to be here at the summit meeting. And a little bit about my background first in the rare disease community. I have two children, a 15 and a 16-year-old with Fragile X syndrome. I have a background in the pharmaceutical industry and changed careers, did a 180 a few years ago once I learned the many challenges, not only in terms of caregiving for a child with special needs, getting to appointments, et cetera, but then I really wasn't thinking about the long-term picture in terms of preparing the family and all the family members, including your loved ones with special needs, for potential long-term and what happens when they go from childhood into adulthood. So again, the topic today is more of an extended hospital stay, but the focus of special needs planning is really for the big picture, the long-term, which then makes it more capable for people to get through these types of short-term changes and short-term financial situations. So bear with me while I go a little bit about the big picture. So again, these are just some of the things that are important to those of us that are caregivers and parents, maintaining quality of life for ourselves and our loved ones, not only when they're young, but throughout adulthood. How are we going to keep the same quality of life that you envision for them and that they envision for themselves throughout their lifetime? Government benefits are a big piece here. Also, in terms of a family with two caregivers, two parents, and you have maybe a loved one with special needs, you're needing to care or plan for basically a 3-person retirement for including your loved one. So when you have siblings, and this will be tomorrow's topic, you want to potentially provide equitably for your heirs, but that might look different for your neurotypical children versus those with special needs. And of course, minimizing taxes is always a major theme that we want to consider when we're doing any type of financial planning. So I'm going to skip through some of these, but let me go back this one actually. So there's really 3 things that my team at 1847 Financial does to focus on special needs planning. And again, I got into this because I realized that these 3 things each of them involve a lot of different variables. And to coordinate all these things, I didn't see that was happening with traditional types of financial planning. So you really, if you're doing any kind of short-term or long-term planning, you want to work with estate planning attorneys or a financial advisor or both that are well-versed in this area. So the legal aspects would be your estate planning attorney, government benefits and care management for SSI, Medicaid considerations, and then finally the financial piece, which is of course what we do. And if you need to ever find an appropriate special needs planner or estate planning attorney, there are really good two resources are online that you can consult for this, depending on your area. The Special Needs Alliance is one of them. These are certified, qualified professionals that have to be basically elected into these organizations, and also the Academy of Special Needs Planners. So another part of the bigger picture is the Special Needs Trust. So again, this is something that can be considered as part of a financial plan for anybody, but in particular, it's important when you have a child with special needs, because if you're planning on leaving them $2,000 or more of assets to help supplement their needs in terms of government benefits, et cetera, you will discount them from eligibility for Medicaid and also for Social Security disability benefits once they turn 18 years old. So that's an important thing to consider. And that's really the purpose of a special needs trust, which really creates a bubble around any assets that either are today or will be eventually left to the individual. So the beneficiary is the trust itself, the name of the trust itself, which ultimately, though, will go to your loved one with special needs. So again, these are some of the big picture things to think of. And I wanted to then also just mention, when you're working with a estate planning attorney, you want to also talk to them about powers of attorney versus guardianship for your loved ones. And if you have questions about that or need more information, I can help you with determining what the differences are and what might be more appropriate in your situation. But these are some of the legal things. And also, a document that I always provide a template to families for is called the Memorandum of Intent. And this is an important document. It's not a legal document. It's just sort of, I always call it the My Book About Me for your loved one. So it specifies all of the likes, dislikes, doctors, therapists, medications that they're taking, what's their schedule, anything that you would want someone stepping into your shoes as a caregiver to know about your loved one would go into this document. So it's very important, and it can give the caregiver a lot of peace of mind knowing that there's something there should something happen unexpectedly, like a long-term hospital stay. So usually as caregivers, if there's not already one parent that's designated as a full-time caregiver for their loved one, then sometimes that role is part-time, and that you might have to take some time off from work. And I used to experience that myself when I was in the pharmaceutical industry and still raising my son. So one thing that you can do if you are employed is take advantage of employee benefits through your employer. HSA accounts, health savings accounts, are very good things to have put aside, because there's triple tax benefits to an HSA, and they basically get a tax-deductible contribution that grows tax-free, and then when you take a distribution from the account, that's also tax-free if it's for qualified medical expenses, and that's a pretty broad definition. So definitely recommend that. Another way to compensate for like a very expensive short-term or long-term hospital stay is to make sure that you have emergency fund, which usually is defined as about 6 months of fixed savings that you normally spend month to month. So if you can save about 6 months worth of that, that's going to help you through those hardships financially when they come about. Also, something employer related is family medical leave. If your employer offers this benefit, I had to take that myself to take care of my son for a period of time, and it's unpaid leave, but it allows you to keep your position with the company, keep your benefits, et cetera. And then finally, another employer benefit would be the retirement planning vehicles, depending on your line of work. It could be a 401k, a 403b. Usually, as a financial planner, we advise at least making the same amount of contribution as the employer is offering to match. So sometimes that's 50 cents on a dollar, it might be, 100%, dollar for dollar, up to a certain percentage. And just in general, we usually recommend meeting that match because it's essentially free money, but not necessarily to exceed that. Some people think they should just put as much in as possible. There are other vehicles that are going to get you a better return. So just to keep that in mind in terms of when you're doing your employee benefits planning, that's something that can also be helpful. And then other things that you can just do as an individual besides creating the Memorandum of Intent and Special Needs Trust is there are CPAs and tax accountants that are well-versed in special needs planning. I found one myself. It wasn't easy to find one. But there are lots of different tax advantages. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of all of your expenses, all the medical expenses, including hospital stays, co-payments for medications, assistive technology. No matter what it is, save the receipts because you're likely to be able to get a tax deduction at the end of the year if your expenses exceed 10% of your adjusted gross income. So that's your income minus any deductibles that you're taking for dependents and also any standardized deductions or itemized deductions, depending on your situation. Another thing that's relatively new, and then I'll turn it over to Eileen, is the ABLE accounts. Has anybody heard of ABLE Act and ABLE accounts? Okay, I'll go over that a little bit here. So ABLE accounts were approved in 2014, and they're being rolled out state by state. So some states have them available, some states don't at this time. You can go on socialsecurity.gov and other sites to find out information in your particular state. But essentially what they are is a 504 plan, or 529 plan rather, for individuals with special needs and or disabilities. So it's like the same spirit of a college savings account, 529, but specifically for those that have disabilities so that they can save more than that $2,000 cap of money and have up to $100,000 in their name in this savings account that's a pre-tax account. And again, there are some nuances that we're not quite sure about yet, how they're going to be worked out. So right now, we're kind of advising people that they exist, and it's good to know, and it can definitely help supplement a special needs trust, but it doesn't replace a special needs trust because there are certain limits, including a payback provision. If there were to be assets left in the accounts and the individual passed away, they would get paid back in terms of government benefits. They would go back to the government. So ABLE accounts, you can contribute up to $14,000 a year. You can have one per individual with special needs. And again, the overall cap is $100,000, beyond which then there are tax consequences beyond that. So it's something nice. I think if you have an individual maybe that's working, that wants to have their own savings, that's a very good option. And again, the terms are that it's for disability-related expenses, which are yet to be defined, but we're hopeful that they'll be very broad. So I'll turn over to you, Eileen. Thank you.
Are you going to transition, or do I go through all of her slides? I can do that. I wasn't sure. Okay. Okay, here we go. So, a little bit about who I am. As Beth introduced me before, I am the president of the Association for Child Life Professionals. I also serve as the Family Services Manager at Children's Hospital in Wisconsin. And I've spent most of my career working with children and families at Children's Hospital in one form or another. I spent many years working with oncology families, spent some time in our palliative care program and in our bereavement program. So I find myself now as one of the family services managers that is fortunate enough to still be working alongside all of those professions. So you will note that some of my examples that I am bringing with me today have some grief undertones, if you will, to them. And I was reading through some of my notes, and there was an article that I had read recently about trauma, and there's been a lot of work on trauma-informed care, and they talk a little bit about grief and how it weaves through so much of illness and disease, because there's so much loss along the way that we hear this phrase a lot, but it kind of, when there's a major life disruption, it leaves a new normal in its wake. So that is a little bit of why some of my examples have some grief undertones to it. I'm going to primarily talk today about staying connected. I put the word compromise in there, and I'll talk a little bit to what that means, because it sounds like a negative. But what I'm really referring to when I do talk about compromise is, and those of you who are super parents and advocates know that it's all about balancing where you put your energy. So when I use the word compromise, you'll see in one of the stories that I'm bringing with me today, one of my patients, that it's really about balance and energy. And then being a companion. And again, those of you who are advocates already are well versed and skilled in companioning. But I like to bring the philosophy of companioning, especially to arm yourself with the premise behind that, because it's not about having answers to our questions. Sometimes it's the very act of being and being present with someone that's the most support. So this is one of my little patients that I'm bringing with me today. I stole all of these pictures that I have from my archives of patients that I've worked with. So I won't read this poem to you, but I learned a lot over the years about the wave of hope. And I think that there's even an article in the little magazine that they gave us about genomes, about the most important facet that a physician can give a patient is hope. So when we talk about long hospitalizations, I think it's really important that we might not be getting all the information that we want to from our providers, but it's really important to continue to ride that wave and to figure out ways to infuse and inspire that journey of a hospitalization. And so I'm going to bring a couple friends with me. So I'm going to bring one friend whose name is Teddy. I met Teddy when he was 3 years old, and at the time, Teddy had a heart condition. He was inpatient for a bone marrow transplant, and Teddy also had Down syndrome. And basically my job at that time as a child life specialist was to help the team help him understand that he couldn't leave his room, which sounds easy, but my philosophy is always child first. I don't know how to keep any child in a room who is mobile enough. And so we did a lot of theme days and stop signs in his room to teach him where he could go and where he couldn't go. So we used as many cues that he understood to help shape his control. Basically, that's how we put it to him and his family. So fast forward through his formative years, Teddy continued to shape who I am, as do many of my best teachers, I think. Didn't really have a lot of, as we like to refer, alphabet after their name, because they're patients and families who taught me really about the courage of coping with long-term hospitalizations, being an advocate and asking the right questions to the right people, and for the rest of us, just get out of the way. So He came back when he was 16 years old, and I had known and followed him this entire time, but now his journey was a little bit different as a 16-year-old. I didn't so much have to contain him, but I had to keep him busy and figure out ways that we could plan for when he was able to get out of his room. So I'm going to go to a University of Madison in Wisconsin, so a shameless plug to Go Badgers. But so one of our residents at the time was the drum major, and we decided that to pass some of the time in Teddy's room, we would have him rip paper so that he could have a parade when he got out of his room. So it gave him the opportunity to focus on something every day, and then we all had to keep planning our events. So when things got challenging, we would remind him of what the ultimate outcome was going to be. And I think what I will share with you that we did have a parade, and it was probably, and this was many years ago, but it was probably one of those moments where as a staff person you laughed and cried, because Teddy had a personality bigger than life itself and taught me a lot about acceptance. And he made everyone participate in this parade, and he took a couple of months of shredded paper and just that was confetti. So, but one of the reasons I'm bringing Teddy with me is something that I don't really need to preach to any of you. But the reason why my everlasting learning moment with Teddy was acceptance is that Teddy brought one of the Star Wars characters, and forgive me, I'm probably the only one on the planet that only saw the first Star Wars, but apparently there's a character named Lando, for those of you that know. So Lando came with him to every single inpatient admission. And over the years, Lando got a wee bit tattered. It was the same Lando. And in his last admission, Lando, he didn't have clothes. I think he only had one arm, and he doesn't have a head. But he was there. So I used that as my life lesson so I could bring his legacy with me. And actually, his parents ultimately ended up giving me Lando. And I met Teddy many years ago, and I still have Lando on my desk as a reminder so that when people ask me why he's there, I can share Teddy's story of acceptance. So I put... connecting when I think of long-term hospitalizations, and I think how children achieve comfort, control, and I'm going to say inspire, because I think a lot of children are way more resilient than we are as an adult, because their learning is intermittent, and when they're happy, and when they're sad, and they don't have the life experience that we do to kind of resonate with a certain thought or feeling over a long period of time, which is the grace of children. So when I just put a few reminders to us all and how we stay connected, and we talked a little bit this morning about making sure that everything that we do is developmentally appropriate and compassionate, so that even though someone is operating at a different cognitive level, you make sure that you still respect their chronological age. So helping them stay connected however one needs to stay connected has really transpired over the years thanks to some advances in technology. Kids can even bring their school classrooms with them. In fact, here's another friend of mine. She had a very rare diagnosis, and she wanted to go to her school. So every hospitalization, we would prepare for meeting her school. So we used our time when she was in the hospital to, again, prepare for something that was a normal part of everyone else's life. Only she had hid her diagnoses from everyone at school, which is pretty typical. And she told them that she got bit by a cat, and that's why, I don't know why, the cat thing, but that's why she had to, have bandages, and she's 13 at the time and made up a phenomenal story. So I used her creativity, and basically I said, "Are you prepared for me to call you out being a big fat liar during this in front of all of your middle school friends?" And she said, "Yeah, that would be really cool." So, okay. So we did this presentation to all of her friends in middle school, and she was there. She hid in the back of the room, but it ended up being an amazing experience for me because this was a group of middle schoolers. So sorry, but that wasn't my comfort zone at all. And we got to bring the very best of who she was to the table. And it allowed me to remind all of us that what separates us as far as being different is very small compared to what brings us together and how we're all very similar. And that we talk a lot about being a child first, and what children need is affirmation and love. And at the end of the day, if that's all you can do as a parent, an advocate, or a provider, then that's really, at the end of the day, all of us need is affirmation and love, and it can never be underestimated. I also want to share that the picture that you see there is actually was done by one of our art therapists, and some of the kids that I'm talking about today, their silhouettes are in this picture. We, some of the hospitals now are doing hospital proms. I think we've had 7, and I think we use the word a lot at this Global Genes Conference of being normal, and how important it is to point out when things are normal and how we should celebrate the ordinary in the extraordinary. And I remember when my leader said, "We're having prom here at the hospital," and I said, "I don't know how you're going to do that." I'm pretty sure I have off that day. But it ended up being an amazing experience. And this last June, as I said, we have had our 7th one, and we had 50 patients, inpatient and outpatient. More wheelchairs and beds came to prom, and continues to hold true to just be an amazing experience for our patients, families, and our staff. So this is Sam, and Sam had mitochondrial disease, and I put his picture up there under compromise mostly because I think he was the king of adaptation. And his mom, who partnered with me on many of my teachings to our residents at the hospital about perseverance and what it takes to help a family get through not just a long-term hospitalization, but partnering with them in their child's rare diagnosed journey. Sam is the 4th sibling, and he was actually born after his brother, who was the 3rd child in their family, was diagnosed. So it took Zach and his mom 6 years to get him diagnosed, and they found out that all 4 children had mitochondrial disease. Ann Ullman is Sam's mom and wrote a book called The Light of One Star. It's actually a journal, and I was sharing with someone, I read it again, even though I lived it with her, but it's over 500 pages of just her 2 boys' journey. Her 2 girls are more mildly affected. The reason for her title, and I had to look this up again, is The Light of One Star. Stargazing was one of their favorite things to do as a family, and it didn't matter where you were. So one of the things that we like to talk to people about when you're in the hospital, to find something that's common between you and everyone else at home. So whether it's watching the sun set or the moon rise. In their case, it was stargazing. And she said, no matter how dim the light of one star may be to the human eye, it reflects and radiates from one person to another. And Anne's mission in life was not just to leave her 2 boys' legacy, but she invited all of us to look beyond Sam's limitations and to celebrate his life. And I learned from her that through the journey, especially of rare diagnoses, so many people worry about life's ending. And my message from being with them is that if you treat someone like they're dying, then they have nothing to live for. So best to treat each day as it comes and to live it to its fullest for kids, some of the things, the gifts that we can give them are the three things that I put up there is when we have very little control over our lives, routine, especially for children. Children love predictability because it gives them control in an environment that appears uncontrollable. It gives them choices. And I remember, not Sam, but another little boy who was in the hospital, and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds are great because they're super articulate, but they don't have the sort of emotional prowess to back up some of what they've said. So sometimes they're just super angry because there's so much going on, in their heads that their hearts just can't keep up with it. And I remember one of the boys, he was in the playroom, and smart as he was, kept turning up the radio. At that time, it was a radio. And anyone who visited the room, he couldn't hear them because he kept turning the radio up. His mom was getting very frustrated that he wasn't being a good little boy, in quotes. And I pulled her aside and I said, he's brilliant. And, she kind of calmed down because we all want to hear that about our children. And I said, he can't hear them. So if they tell him to do anything, he can't do it because he didn't hear them. So she backed off, and I said, give him a month. Once he knows a little bit more about this place and a little bit about who we are, he'll start to own this place. And he did. He dressed up as an officer of the law on Halloween and issued everyone citations, which I thought was great. And don't you wish you could do that just once? The other piece up here is, again, adapting. And, we take advantage of the gifts and strengths that people have. I think that's something that resonates well beyond the hospital experience. I talked a little bit about ritual through that routine, but teaching kids to meditate and yourselves to meditate is, again, transcends outside of the hospital experience, but there's a lot of literature and research that supports even just a 2-minute diversion can do a lot to rejuvenate the spirit. So kids can learn how to meditate. They don't have to speak to learn how to meditate. And sometimes it can be 10 seconds of just teaching them to breathe or focus on something. And I invite you all to practice and participate in that practice as well. Am I doing okay for time? Because I really don't know what time it is. Okay. Companioning. So I won't take too much time on companioning. I think, sorry, my sinuses are completely whacked. I feel like I'm sniffling up here, so excuse me. So now I really do need a tissue. What I'm trying to say by companioning is we don't need to have all the answers, and a lot of times we don't. So it's very important, as I said in the beginning, to be that presence, that person that someone can confide in. And I invite you all as advocates, thank you so much. Sorry. So glad that this is being videotaped too. Oh, okay. I'm going to just fast forward to my other slide because they're both on companioning. And I'm not going to read these through for you. But again, in healthcare, we have perfected the art form of healing. But when you walk into our house of healing, and we can't heal you, you bring complexity. And Anne, both of her boys who were affected very severely died within 2 years of one another. And she came back to work because, remember, she's a nurse. And she said, I came back to work, but everyone has this newfound interest in the ceiling tiles because every time I come in our room, people don't look at me, they look up. And I said to her, in all honesty, that you have entered our house of healing, and you represent something that is our greatest fear. And you walk through the halls confident, even though we know that you don't have a choice in your journey, but we don't know what to say because we are the house of healing. So remember that as your supreme advocacy is we're not good at not fixing. And as the saying goes that the student becomes the teacher, one of Anne's, again, greatest lesson that she taught me is for people to not be afraid to say, I don't know. A lot of times her kids looked awful on paper, and yet they were running around and were complex. So she would guide them through that. In fact, when one of her daughters went off to college and she got the call, and finally the resident was just, the voice was quivering, and he said, I really don't know where to start. And she said, thank you. I know where to start. Let me guide you. So the tenets of companioning are really about being a guide. And I put them up there, not just for you, but to guide those who walk this journey with you and give them permission to stumble as well. And resiliency. Oh, I don't really need to speak too much to this group about being resilient, but I am going to quote, I hope it's a compliment, but I actually ripped a page out of Anne's book, so those of you who might know her, don't tell her I did that, I'll put it back. I just didn't want to bring the book. She writes a lot, and it was 500 pages. This was a quote actually from the Journal of American Medicine, I think, and it was by Frank Bruni. Actually, this was from the New York Times. I lied. She's also very well read. But he says we can't really predict tomorrow. We can't guarantee its arrival with a specified number of calories or a given allotment of sleep. With a milligram of dark chocolate or ounces of fiber, we can often determine the measure of joy we wring out of today. So when I think of being resilient, I think that I've probably learned how to bounce back from the patients and families that I've been fortunate enough to journey with. And I think that the message is that when we don't think we can, we need to find something that turns it into can-do. And my key takeaways, because I think I only have 1 minute left. So first of all, thank you for dealing with my sniffling. So remember person first. So when all else fails, when we're looking at a long hospital stay or a long healthcare journey, I remember a little boy whose parents were separated at the time, and the siblings were mad as heck. And they said, you know, every time we go by Dad's, the little boy asks us to tie his shoes for him and button his shirt and help him. And every time we're by Mom's, Mom does that. And I said, well, let me ask him, do you know how to tie your shoes? And he said, yeah. And I said, why don't you tie them? And he said, well, if someone else can do it, then why not? And I just said, you've been played. So kids are wise, and we have to allow them to do as much for themselves as they possibly can. And remember that they still, they'll play the card because they're wise. And affirmation is underrated. As I said before, what kids need at the end of the day is love and affirmation, and it goes a long way. Hope evolves over time, and just be patient with yourself and relentless in advocacy. That's all I have on my slides, and we have a few minutes left over, I believe, for questions.
Thanks to you both. I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions that were submitted via the app. So why don't you guys decide who wants to take which one? The first is, if my child is double covered by my spouse and my insurance, is there any benefit with using the employee, this says cafeteria type accounts? We don't have very much out-of-pocket expenses.
Okay, so the question is,
Just test this.
okay. So they both are employed and have employee benefits? And they're asking?
That's the way it seems from the question.
Okay.
Double
so they wanna-
covered by both
Okay.
parents, yep.
And so the question is, should they obtain any other type of coverage outside of that?
Yes.
Okay.
Because they don't have many out-of-pocket expenses.
Okay. Well, if their child is eligible for medical assistance, I would definitely recommend applying for and maintaining that coverage year to year, because it's one of those things where you never know when you're going to need a secondary insurance to come in and cover. And medical assistance, or Medicaid as it's called, can take care of a lot of very large out-of-pocket expenses that the primary insurance doesn't cover. So just because they may not be there now, it's always better to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to those things. So I would recommend applying for medical assistance in this case.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, I suppose also for you. A single father with a rare disease child who receives a waiver for PDN. He's told annually not to earn much money over what his daughter receives for SSI, or she will lose everything. How can he have a job and have her not lose everything?
It depends on the age of the daughter. But if she is, it depends on the state they live in also. In some cases, there are states that have Medicaid loopholes so that she would maintain her government benefits regardless of her parents' assets. And that's pretty typically the case with SSI. So there shouldn't be any fear of her losing her benefit based on his income. And then once she turns 18 years old, she can then, that's when the $2,000 asset limits come into place, because at that point, the government is looking at assets in the name of the child. So that's why it's important not to, if you anticipate supports and services that are going to be needed by the child past the age of 18, definitely don't name them as a beneficiary of life insurance or retirement plans, et cetera, because that will knock them out of eligibility for SSI. So I hope that helps. So it's somewhat age dependent.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions from the audience?
Two. One is that there were a lot of facts that you gave us. Are those slides going to be available to us?
I believe that they are
Because I was
available
looking for them
online.
and didn't see them. But I don't know. At the end of the conference? Oh, cool. Okay, so I'm a social worker at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and one of my greatest challenges is helping families recognize that they really need to sign up for all the things that they are eligible for, and all, including supplemental security income. So I get the whole piece of like not having too much, but I end up running into the problem of helping families recognize what they can get for their youth. So the question for both of you, do you run into that challenge, or do you have any suggestions for me?
In terms of advice to families on how to maximize like their benefits? Oh, just to get into the system. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've always found that you can get applications by going to the local Social Security office, which is what I did, or if they're in school, they can ask supports coordinators. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my point
Correct.
is not that they don't know how to get the things.
Okay.
My point is I say to the families, you really need to register. Here's how you do it. And they say, I'm middle income, I don't need any of this.
Okay.
It's not important
I
for
see.
me.
Right.
And then their kiddos turn
Yeah.
18
Yes.
and they're not registered with anything and they end up sitting home.
Well, and thank you for clarifying that, because the biggest thing is that you want to get your child registered with the county with whatever their diagnosis is. If they are considered disabled in any manner, they need to be registered with the county to be recognized by the government, so that when they do apply, and this has to be done before they're 22 years old, you want them to be registered in the system so that they can, again, be eligible for adult services. So that's a very important point. And also that allows them to be eligible for Social Security disability income if they qualify based on their parents' work record or theirs in some cases. And usually SSDI benefits are greater than SSI benefits. So it's their right, it's their entitlement really. So they need to do that.
Other questions? Okay, let me just check the app. Okay, well, our speakers are going to stick around for a little bit if you'd like to talk with them. Thank you so much for coming. You can review this panel on the app. Please do take a moment to review. And the next session will start in this room at 3:15. Thank you.